Hey, Brandon,
Hey, Alan.
and welcome to Dice Over Everything, the miniature gaming podcast.
So, have you been noticing much nostalgia for like the 80s and 70s lately, or is it just me?
I've been feeling it personally.
Okay.
Yeah,
What?
man, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, great.
Oh, damn. Are they coming back again?
Uh, no, well, for me, yes.
Oh,
Just like reading a bunch of comics and watching YouTube videos about the history of,
hmm.
and then looking back and saying, "Wow, this was not as good as I remember it."
Oh, okay. Which reminds me, I guess for music I've been listening to lately in DJs, been hearing a lot more like funk and disco. But
Hmm.
on the note of things not being quite as you remember them, the
Hmm.
people aren't actually playing the true 80s versions. They're playing remixed house versions.
Of
So I guess
course,
our
yeah.
our tastes have evolved to expect a little more cleanliness, let's say.
It can't be down gritty and dirty, unlike some things from the 80s and 90s,
Hmm.
which leads to our topic.
Oh, the the grimdark and the cyberpunk that comes out of the, well, I guess
Yes.
I would almost say that 80s I would say is more where cyberpunk might start to emerge,
Hmm.
like with novels and stuff. Obviously, that like it's hard for us to talk about novels because a lot of the sci-fi stuff comes out of novels. But the
Hmm.
thing is, like everyone has a different visual image when you read a book. Whereas so once it
Hmm.
gets into media like film, movies, and all that, and miniature
Hmm.
games, of
And
course,
art, yeah, and miniature gaming.
because we'll try and tie it into that. But because
Yeah.
the games we like are often in the sci-fi world,
Yep.
maybe grimdark, and the better one may be cyberpunk. But like the visual imagery, like the books, you've got 70s books that start to get into sci-fi, and then 80s, the whole genre starts to become a little more well known, and the
Yeah.
books start reaching us now. But in terms of the imagery, I think we get more of our imagery from like our shared imagery from TV shows and movies, especially.
Yeah, these days.
Hmm.
And so when we think about, in terms of miniature gaming, sci-fi is a huge portion of it, basically led by Grimdark and like the granddaddy of Grimdark, which is Warhammer 40,000.
Yeah, that's why, because we're interested in miniatures games and
Mm-hmm.
the sort of the worlds that get created
Mm-hmm.
there. So
And so
the
you see the
generic.
aesthetic
Mhm.
of these two things, like how of the aesthetic that we're consuming is often the two major sci-fi influences of I guess you'd say the popular ones right now are cyberpunk, grimdark, and I guess the third one would be post-apocalyptic, but that
Yep.
well ties into and to grimdark. The particular flavor of post-apocalyptic we consume is in miniature games is generally grimdark.
Yeah, I think we'll get into the sort of difference between those two, but
Mm-hmm.
the ones I find have the most flavor. Like, as you can think of our world just slowly progressing into sci-fi, where it
Mm-hmm.
hasn't taken a big turn, and you're like, okay, that's where we're going. It probably will be more like cyberpunk. But when you watch TV shows, like if you think about Star Trek,
Capitalism, baby. Just getting
yeah,
a little bit of
if you
political
think about
there.
like the mainstream, like you think mainstream sci-fi, you think Star Trek, you think Star Wars, and you
Mm-hmm.
think about how the people live there, and it feels more like a progression of our current society,
Mm-hmm.
where they haven't gone into the all-out war of the grim dark.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not. We can explain what these concepts a bit more.
Yeah. We,
But
we've basically talked about it, but we haven't really explained
no,
grim dark versus cyberpunk.
I
What is
think we'll
grim
get
dark
there,
and
but
what is cyberpunk?
I think I want to go over what we sort of see as our future, and then how
Okay,
those
sure.
deviate from our future. So if we think of like those two main star sci-fis in the
Mm-hmm.
future of Star Wars, like your average person living there isn't in the middle of the war. They just sort of go out living their lives. Maybe they're on the upper echelons, maybe they're on the lower,
Mm-hmm.
but society more or less is divided how we see it currently. And then when you, at least human society, we'll get back to that later. I think human
So
society,
divided between war and or what do you call it, frontier and the main portion of the bulk of people.
yeah, the main bulk of the Federation isn't living
Uh-huh.
in some sort of like war torn society. And
or,
they're
or
not,
frontier land where there's constantly conflict or weird aliens of the or problems of the week that have to be solved.
Yeah, there's not the dystopianism to it really,
Uh-huh.
which
Yeah.
I think is a defining feature of cyberpunk, and the grimdark is the dystopian edge to it. But we'll
Mm-hmm.
go back to that after. And when you look at Star Wars, especially when you
Mm-hmm.
start watching more of the offshoots, like Clone Wars or Rebels, that get more into the non-war aspect of it, where you see more of the general people's lives. Like
Mm-hmm.
most of them are just kind of going through their life almost more like we are now. And oddly enough, like
Mm-hmm.
they've got less technological interaction than we do. Like they don't go around holding smartphones.
Yes,
But
because it's from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
uh-huh. Even though they can communicate across the stars, they're like, let's just not do that in day-to-day life. They went back to a more
Because they have no one to talk to if they're in another galaxy. They're like, why would I want to talk to some Jawas on a different planet?
okay, that could be it. They have
I
everything they
hate
need.
sand. Gets everywhere.
They don't want to see the media coming out of the stupid Ewoks.
Although, did you see them jamming on those helmets and skulls? It's pretty baller. They could probably start traveling as a performance band.
Yeah, no, I don't want to keep scrolling through my feed. I'll keep seeing more of those. Anyways, so I think what we got to is that, so those are like, if we expect that things just keep going linearly without hitting a dystopian edge,
Mm-hmm.
then kind of we expect those to be the future. But there's the other way that the future can go, like we talked about post-apocalyptic, which is obviously dystopian, where everything just falls apart. But then in the cyberpunk and possibly the grimdark worlds, like things are still like the population hasn't disappeared. They're all still there, but something's gone dystopian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the easiest one to start off with would
So
be
so to divide it from Star Wars and Star Trek, the idea is that Star Wars and Star Trek seems it's applying the current understanding of humanity and our track to just extrapolating into the future or the past. But really, when you look at Star Wars, it's literally wars in space, right? What happens if we had our world and we went forward? It's the same world, the same kind of concepts in the world, but now it's over a galactic scale with spaceships and also space wizards. And then Star Trek is literally what happens if everything turns out a-okay, partner, all the way into the future. What would our world be?
yeah.
Whereas when we talk about cyberpunk and grimdark, there's a sharp turn where we're like, whether for whatever reason, this is not, like all dystopian fiction. It's what happens if there's a something like extrapolating it, something bad happens and changes our what people conceive as the path of humanity.
Yep. So I think cyberpunk's the easier one to describe because it's probably it's probably less of a deviation from those paths.
Arguably, it is way more probable than Star
Mhm.
Wars and Star Trek happening.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I think it sort of spawns out of a lot of the 80s aesthetics and the 80s like projection of what might happen in the future because 80s brought us a lot of punk and all that. Like the sort of
Counterculture to the well, we had a lot of it. It's almost surprising actually when I think about it. It's like 80s is like 40 years ago. Um, the politics is definitely a factor in creating the cyberpunk idea, right?
Mhm.
Like cyberpunk is quintessentially punk, which is a counterculture against the rising uh, perceived authoritarianism of the right wing in Britain, right? And you can
Yeah, it's
see
like
it all over their media.
yeah, like the whole look of punk is okay, you've got your ideal look or society's ideal of people all dressed up in
Mm-hmm.
suits and everything else like that, just being quite proper. And
Yeah.
then the punks have taken on not the same look for everybody, but they're doing something to deviate and to show that they're
Mm.
not part of
It's
that.
intentionally deviational in opposition. It is not. It's
Mhm.
not coming out of its own aesthetic blossoming from its past. It is coming out as a counterculture to what was at the time the mainstream Margaret Thatcher, also culture of the people that were in charge.
Yeah, it's not like our
Right?
hipsterism where they're all going a different
Mhm.
direction, but all doing the same thing with their ironic beards and their plaid. That's all going the same direction. The punks were trying to do like be different, but
I,
not in the same way.
I think, yeah, I think the punk kind of aesthetic was intrinsically political, whereas hipsters are not, right? Hipster is like the counterculture without any real reason. At
Okay.
least the way we describe hipsterism, right?
Mhm.
It's the being different just to be special. Whereas the punks were, the idea of punk is to be different for a specific message, right? It
Yep.
is not, it's not different for difference's sake, which is the hipster aesthetic or ideal
Mhm.
as understood by the common culture nowadays, right? Whereas the punk is, and there are still punks today, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the other element of the cyberpunk is sort of the cyber part, where in the 80s we were starting to get all sorts of more electronic music, like synth
Mhm.
pop and all that started becoming popular. And it
Yep.
was it was
Giving
complete
rise to
deviation.
kind of, yeah, an aesthetic and an idea of a cybernetic future.
Hmm. Yeah, so the music they were creating was what they figured was the music of the future, which it
Hmm.
kind of has made it's like all the sounds they were developing there have made
Yep.
their way into our current music now. I
Yep.
mean, just like we said before, they've become more refined, just like funk has
Yep.
turned into sort of, well, disco has turned into something like funky house. It's kind of
Hmm.
melded its way into a more consumable product, but it still has a
Hmm.
bit of the original vibe to it. So,
The entire sound and the ideas, it's like the thing with the 80s and electronics, right? The punk is, see, at least as we understand it, it is comes out of the music scene, right? A music scene kind of thing. Although, I'm not a punk. Was not a punk. I'm actually too well, I'm not even on the right continent to from where it began. But of course, punk spread everywhere in Western culture. But like, I'm just from the outside looking in. Um, it was heavily like a music, like music is where the what do you call it? The flag holders of punk kind of push through.
mhm. Yeah, I think the technology thing made its way into everyday life. And so did like
Hmm.
that synth music started making its way into like, you think of the commercials and everything else like that.
Hmm.
They would adopt that music pretty readily.
Hmm. And if you look at music, it is sorry. This is the point. I got distracted by the punk part. The cybernetic, the the electronic, what do you call it? Revolution of music happened, right? Because the synths started happening, and you can see now. Actually, it's complete, right? That any producer or composer will use electronically created instruments to build their music. Nobody like writes down the notes and then has to go to play it out, right?
Yeah,
to to
like I've said
to
before, I've probably been watching too much Twitch lately, but people there sometimes on their stream show their musical creation process. So they'll be creating all the beats and all that and a lot of the melody in just programs, but then they'll overlay like their actual voice, or if they play guitar, they'll have real, like some real elements to it. But
yep, and piano, right? But if they do piano, it will all be digitized, right? The piano is almost like the input and it
it's
goes
not,
through,
yeah, it's not an analog piano with strings.
yeah,
It's
where
all,
you record it and put it in, right?
hmm?
And so, um, which is just talking, it's not exactly like, okay, so obviously there's lots of bands that, play, right? But um, when we talk about the pop culture music that we consume, um, rock bands and like bands that play and make their music primarily through just
And
jamming and stuff is no longer the top 10 songs on Billboard. If you look at them, like I'm gonna bet nine, if not all 10 songs, all of the instruments that are playing are synthesized, right? Although they're made to sound like, real things.
Yeah, technology keeps getting better and better. It no longer sounds like it's that kind of sounds like.
Yeah.
Now they decide if it sounds synthetic or not. It's part of the.
Yes, but it's technically all gone through the same, I don't know, the same synthetic kind of thing, right? And the idea that it is so different from like playing playing an instrument, just an analog instrument, is uh it's almost not even there. It's become transparent.
Yep, it's become the norm. So projecting that into the future, well, it's not us projecting it into the future.
I wonder if I overstated it. 9 out of 10. It's probably, maybe it's lower than that.
It might just be our taste in music. Anyhow,
10 out of 10 of the songs that I like are all done on computer. Yeah, I think 9 out of 10 is too high. If you look, there's probably more. My guess is actually there's going to be more that are played by an actual band, but it's got to be it's got to be pretty high. I would say almost certainly more than half, at least in America.
Sure.
I'm going to be wrong. You know what? I'm going to check the Billboard charts, and it's going to be like, oh, fuck. 5 out of 10 are country songs.
One in the world. Anyway.
And then 3 of them are just like songs with a what do you call it? A band. Like
it's gonna be harmonica music, and you're like, what's going on? The world's
maybe anyway. I'm getting distracted.
Yeah. So back to the cyberpunk thing, it's sort of, I guess, part of how they project it is that people keep getting more and more attached to technology, that they don't go the way of the Star Wars and Star Trek universes where people keep their distance from the technology. They're like, no, people keep getting more integrated with technology, and technology becomes more and more part of the world they're interacting. Just like you said with the music, with our music now, it's being created more and more by machine, and the things we interact with now are more and more. If you're interacting with something online, you're just buying things off a computer. You're not calling someone on the phone. You're not going to the store. Now you're like, okay, in the future, am I just going to walk into a store and buy things from robots? Like, that's the cyberpunk future that they're projecting.
Yep.
And more, like, you think of the billboards done in the 70s, they may have been like designed by hand and all that. And we keep going more and more digital now. Today, when you go like to the downtown of a major city, you won't be seeing printed billboards. You'll just be seeing like giant projection screens, LCD screens. And then you take it further to, like, you think of the futuristic cities like Tokyo, and there's just like lights everywhere, and it's almost the aesthetic of cyberpunk if you think of it at night.
Yeah, like Times Square in America, in New York, right? You look at Times Square, how much of that is digital screens and things like that. And like you're saying, we don't have, I guess, how much time do people spend, like, although we're not jacked in like in the Matrix or something like that, how much time do we spend just staring at a screen? My entire job, I have to stare at a screen. And now, especially in like COVID, I don't even leave my home. I just stare at I wake up, go to my screen, jack in, and then stare at it until lunch. Go to my fridge, get something, come sit down, eat it while then staring at my screen more.
Consume entertainment while you eat on the screen.
Yeah. Which I probably, now that we mentioned, I probably shouldn't do that. I should probably just go sit up. Now that the weather's nice, I should sit on my patio and just like unplug.
You should live more like Star Trek and less like
yes, like Cyberpunk. Yeah, so let's go in a little bit more deeply now that we're getting into the meat. Yep.
Okay. Well, what
you continue? If you have something more that you want to go through.
What makes the cyberpunk dystopian?
And I think that's quintessentially important for cyberpunk. So I think cyberpunk, we have to look at cyberpunk as, like you said, it's an amalgamation of the cyber and the punk, but who actually did this amalgamation? It was writers, right? The initial cyberpunk is came at, like, a term was used to describe a bunch of stories, right? The most popular and the first one to really gain recognition being Neuromancer by William Gibson, right? There's a couple of stories. There was the idea, like you said, comes from extrapolations of what was actually happening at the time, right? You have the cybernetic. I keep on saying cybernetic because I'm actually thinking about cyberpunk as we know it now. But the electronic music, this idea of digitizing and electronic things taking over traditionally physical portions of our life and constantly being more and more into this virtual electronic world on the one side, combined with this punk aesthetic, which is counterculturally actually is this counterculture in that's spread around the West, right?
Well, yeah, you can think of when something becomes dystopian, people are going to start rebelling against the main
Mm-hmm.
narrative. So it makes complete
And
sense, something dystopian, to have a lot of punk elements appearing.
yeah, and so I think the important thing to kind of realize is like when you read these books, basically Neuromancer and all these things, they're dystopian, right? They are looking into the future and taking these two ideas, one which it was happening at the time, right? Like technically still happening, but and then the other is the electronic things, putting them together, projecting into the future, right?
Yeah, at
And
that
so
time,
what is so to me when I think about the dystopian, like what is the quintessential cyberpunk portion is does the cyber part is the cyber part the quintessential part of cyberpunk, or is the punk part the important part of cyberpunk?
I think aesthetically, the cyberpunk is the cyber is important aesthetically, but I think from the whole narrative and world part, the
Mm-hmm.
the people becoming punk in response to the dystopian world they live in is the more, I think, narratively important portion.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I would agree. And
And
I would say
I think
if you
though that
look
how
at
they
it, like you're talking about dystopian. Sorry.
Mhm.
Yeah, go on.
I think though that how they play off of each other though is that part of the dystopianism or the dystopian environment occurs as a result of the increasing technology that you always have, like
Mm-hmm.
Luddites rebelling against like the changes in society they see breaking society down through technology, like coming more and more. Just people like, oh, you're producing newspapers now no one's going to interact because they're just holding a newspaper in front of their face on the train. And now we come to 2020
I
where everyone is not interacting properly because they've got their smartphones in front of them. They're not actually talking to people because they're on the smartphones. And you keep taking it steps and steps further until people's interaction starts becoming very, very odd in the future. And that sort of creates this sort of dystopian
mm,
environment.
I would say that's actually not the punk aesthetic of
Yep.
cyberpunk. I wouldn't say I would
Well,
say the original
I don't think
Luddite
that's what people are rebelling
is
against, though. Is
I no, I don't think so.
confused by it. No.
I don't think when I read Neuromancer, like you think about Neuromancer or the other books about them, they're not about rebelling against the technology. In fact, that's why I say the punk portion is so important because the the thing that makes cyberpunk so interesting,
Mm-hmm.
right, is not like is that the the people that created this stuff didn't hate technology, right? In fact, like there was a huge embrace of technology, and you can even see the main characters of Neuromancer are characters who are the most cybernetic of the like they're on the bleeding edge of futurism, right? The idea of post-humanism is not a negative in cyberpunk.
Mm-hmm.
It is the punk portion.
Yeah.
It is the use of the technology to overcome to not overcome, but to control society, right? Which is the punk aesthetic. When you look at the history, what was the punk aesthetic rebelling against? It was government control, creeping authoritarianism. And you can see it all over the popular media that survives today, possibly because the media that survives today is still relevant today. You look at uh, V for Vendetta,
Yep.
right? Is and Watchmen Two of
Well,
okay, I'm a big comic book nerd,
I'm trying to
so
think of the movie where they did the part two lately.
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, there you go. Blade Runner 2047.
Hmm.
The original Blade Runner was actually based more in the era like closer to where these aesthetics started happening.
Yeah,
And
I'd say
that's
so.
they're
I'd say
actually
it's
going,
an originator of cyberpunk.
yeah, because the
It
people
is
there,
part of what built everyone's idea of what cyberpunk is.
yeah, because people were like building technology into themselves,
Hmm.
and everybody was becoming like very unique and unusual ways through integrating themselves with technology.
Hmm. I would say the important part, though, right, like what separates that from the other, what you would say is like the Star Trek or the Star Wars or things like that or other kind of media, is the idea that we haven't even really mentioned is corporations taking over the world and using like the technology to wrest control of society from the people to uh, these groups whose care is only about profit, right?
Mhm.
I think this is core, right? This anti-authoritarianism, but also this ability for people to be controlled through technology and consumerism, unbeknownst to them, really,
Mhm.
is a core part of what makes cyberpunk punk, but also cyberpunk, right?
You've got
And
some people in that world who are just going along with the corporations and who are going like integrating the technology in the way that the corporations want them to. And then there's people who are sort of on the fringes taking the technology, but then doing their own punk thing with it.
yeah, and so to me, it's not a Luddite idea, although technically, historically, fun fact, in some ways it is Luddite because the original Luddites apparently in history were not necessarily anti-technology fully, so much as anti losing their ability to control creation of the goods.
Mhm.
So they broke the looms because the looms basically hands over. This is an argument, I guess you could say, about this is probably a socialist uh, understanding or lens of Luddites, but they were breaking the looms because of the idea that they would not have ownership over the means of production. Right? They didn't think about it in that way because this is before that stuff. But like the idea was that they weren't necessarily against technology so much as handing over the ability to create their goods to a merchants, right? The capitalists who are able to then own these things and therefore prevent these people from actually having control over creating of the goods.
Yeah, they didn't think that the Star Wars or Star Trek world was going to happen. They were looking more like
Yes, yeah,
they
they're
were
like this is
expecting
gonna be cyberpunk,
they were
right?
totally
We're all gonna be
expecting.
slaves to the capitalists, which it did happen. So
Mhm.
exactly wrong.
So apparently we're predicting Blade Runner. All right.
Well, you
Enough of
got to
that
think like the
surprise.
punk portion shoved into cyberpunk is not. It was literally taking on the political anger, which, to be fair, like Thatcher did leave, right? Like she wasn't the leader forever, right? And her right, so she did leave, and things did get better. But at the time, there was real fears of creeping government control
Mhm.
happening.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've sort of I don't know if we can describe the aesthetic much more, but the aesthetic sort of comes around the aesthetic of
Mm-hmm.
cyberpunk is sort of based around more of an 80s view of like the bright colors, the neons,
Mm-hmm.
and all that.
Aesthetic
Like our
combined
aesthetic
with
now.
dystopian conflict. So let's bring that finally, now that we've described it,
Mhm.
how does it impact miniatures? How does this cyberpunk aesthetic translate to our beautiful consumerist hobby?
So I think it oddly hasn't influenced as many games as I would hope it would.
Mm-hmm.
Like obviously we play Infinity. We won't have to beat around the bush on that. Infinity is very, very cyberpunk influenced with people having like body modifications, with them having like wrist devices that project light, them having like eye
Mm-hmm.
implants, visors, everything else like that.
I
and
would,
that's
yeah. Mhm.
and even the average people go around with like some level of cybernetic implants in
Mhm.
that world.
Yep.
But other futuristic games often seem.
Wait, can I add one thing?
Yep.
To me, it takes on the aesthetics of what we believe as cyber, but not the punk aesthetics. So I would argue it's
So
not very cyberpunk at all.
so no, not very.
E-
Only some of the
because
only one of the factions actually I would say has that punk element to it, which would be the nomads, who get more into the body modifications. But in reality, most factions are more actually like conforming army based. They've integrated technology,
yep.
but in a more conforming way. They are
And I would
incorporating.
say, yeah, I would say like cyberpunk, basically the ideas of technology
Mhm,
has transcended and spread out further than uh, the cyberpunk genre. In that the cyber portion, the post-humanism has definitely and post-humanism is not um, you know created by cyberpunk, the genre, but
mhm,
the cyberpunk's ideas of post-humanism has definitely influenced the greater technology or the greater genre of a cybernetic post-humanist future,
mhm.
right? And in that way, I think Infinity has taken a lot, but I do not think Infinity is at all cyberpunk. Maybe
No,
not at all, but it is very minimal uh, because there is not the setting is intentionally not supposed to be dystopian,
mhm,
right? Even though it has an AI that runs that is basically runs all of the technology in the human sphere, which is the world.
yep,
Um, they intentionally didn't want to uh, they wanted to make sure that it was a good AI, right?
yep,
They have all of these armies. The game is split up with armies, which are basically the covert ops of different factions, right? But they are intentionally not like controlled by corporations or the idea of like a megacorp or something like that. That idea of punks rebelling against this kind of things, even the nomads, which is the most cyberpunk of the factions,
yeah,
with
because
the most heavy influence from cyberpunk, are in themselves their own, like a nation, right? In the setting. And so the
they're more based
the
towards they have a bit more of a rejection of like the AI that humanity's embraced. They've
mhm.
somewhat rejected that, and they've somewhat gone more towards using technology in more like
Yep.
ununiform ways.
But as their punk stuff is more like aesthetics than it is about a philosophy. And so to me it's not really, it's visually looks cyberpunk, and you could take those models and put them into a cyberpunk game, I think a lot of them,
Mhm.
and they would fit, but I would not say the actual setting or the game is cyberpunk, really.
Okay. All right, because I just envisioned the people in the nomad ships just going more away from the corporate look. Anyhow.
Yeah, but they literally kind of don't. Like you look at Tunguska, they're guys in ties, right? They actually look. The reason why they fit in cyberpunk is because they literally look like
The
corporation
corporate.
people. Like literally, the aesthetics are taken directly from cyberpunk, but all the nations, like all the people in the nation, are actually like both the corporations and uh the punks in what would normally be a cyberpunk setting.
Hmm. Yep.
So to me, oh, were you gonna say other settings?
No, I was trying to think of other miniature games before this that actually
Uh-huh.
embrace that setting, and
So
they're
there is a board game called, I believe, Nakamura Tower or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That has cyberpunk aesthetics. There's a lot more in board games or card games, like Netrunner
Yep.
was a cyberpunk setting, right? The entire idea of Netrunner is literally based on cyberpunk, right?
It's like
It's
attacking
that,
corporations, networks.
yeah, one side is an asymmetric game where one side is a corporation and one side is a hacker, right? Who's trying to take this information. And so though that the entire aesthetic of Netrunner is and story and idea is taken directly from cyberpunk.
Mm-hmm.
The only other one I'd say that we haven't really talked about, there's actually a couple smaller indie games.
Yeah, I noticed games. But was trying to see the bigger games, and the aesthetic is like it still has the most of the aesthetic.
So there's a weird mashup one called. I should have written this down. It's the one where it also mashes in fantasy races.
Okay, doesn't ring a bell.
It's an RPG.
Oh, it's an RPG.
Yeah.
Does it start with an N?
I can't remember the name right now, which is why I'm annoyed that I didn't write it down.
Is it
there's Cyberpunk? There's Cyberpunk. There's literally
is it the RPG we played.
What?
Is it the RPG we've played once before? It starts with an N. Well, that's more of a post-apocalyptic, I would say, where there's revenue technology around. So I don't think it's.
I don't know what game you're talking about. So.
Okay.
What? Just say the name. Do you remember the name, or you literally just remember N?
No, it starts with N. I can't remember the rest of it.
Okay, I was like,
it's not Neuromancer.
What N? What N can you not say?
It's Neuromancer comes to mind because we're talking about Cyberpunk, but it's not. That's why it's confusing me. Anyways.
Okay. Well, technically, there's Cyberpunk, right? There's that.
You have the book, so. Anyways.
Yeah, why didn't we just say Cyberpunk? Shadowrun, that's the one.
Yeah.
So Shadowrun is Cyberpunk, and then they mash in fantasy races for whatever reason, and dragons. I assume because of miniatures. Who knows? But that was pretty popular. And if you play the video games, it's very much like it's a tactical kind of combat game, and it does make. I agree. It does make me question why Cyberpunk has not. Like, it seems like the perfect setting for skirmish miniature games.
Yeah, exactly. Because you have a whole bunch of unique people together. It's not your army where you need to have everybody uniform, which Infinity kind of bridges the scale between the two.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get down to skirmish games, like
and the idea of having like the story of like these cyberpunk stories is always about these punks basically bringing it to doing some sort of mission to bring it to corporations or corrupt people or also they are corrupt, right? And they're doing these kind of things.
Yeah,
right?
And especially because so many more movies have been embracing the cyberpunk sort of themes lately. Like we've that animated Akira. There's Akira from a long time ago, but then Alita Battle Angel lately, where they're in. Have you watched it? No. Okay. I would describe that as sort of cyberpunk, where their use of technology is more towards being individual, at least for the characters that are in that. And then the Ready Player One, it is post-apocalyptic, but how people are interacting with it, I would say, is very. Did you watch Ready Player One as well? Even though it was crap?
Nope.
No, you don't have to watch it, but I watched it for more of the aesthetic, like a while back, where people are more living in the cybernetic world, at least the characters that you're going around, based on how they live their lives. They live in slums, but then in the cyber world, they're sort of like stars. So.
Yeah, so
there's so many movies about it lately. You would think that miniature games would pick up on all those aesthetics.
Yeah, and the idea of having, like you said, 5 or 6 covert teams fighting either your action corporation team
Mhm.
or another what do you call it? I guess you could just call it cyberpunk team. Like it's
Mhm.
literally taken. You can literally take scenes from Neuromancer and be like, this would be an amazing miniatures games where you have like 5 different guys doing very distinct things with different kind of abilities and stuff like that, and then they go at it, right?
Mhm.
While trying to accomplish this cool mission along this cool battlefields. Like it has everything you need for great miniatures games. Interesting objectives, unique characters with interesting abilities. I think the only thing that makes it hard to do is that in the cyberpunk aesthetic, there's the idea of street samurais and like people fighting on the street, but it is with cybernetic implants, post-humans. But there is a heavy idea of hacking, and I feel like the hacking portion is the part that people are, because it's so core to the aesthetics of cyberpunk.
Yeah.
I think people have a hard time understanding how they would put hacking into the game.
Yeah, because that reminds me of Ghost in the Shell as well, which had the recent movie, which was very
Mm-hmm.
disappointing because they didn't make use of the whole. They just they didn't take advantage of the whole concept of people and their interaction with technology. It was more just turned into an action movie with that as a backdrop. Whereas the animated series, the I know there's a whole bunch of them, but I can't remember the
Standalone complex.
Animal Complex. There you go. That one really delved into how people's like interaction with the world was going on when they were in such a cybernetic world, and it showed like the whole hacking element, where when people became dependent on technology, how they then became vulnerable to hacking.
Yeah, I do feel like the well,
But it wasn't.
what do
It
you think
wasn't.
about Ghost in the Shell? Like, do you consider that cyberpunk, or
Nope.
do you, so? I guess here's my question then.
Well,
Um,
some people some people in it were cyberpunk that they interacted with, but
uh-huh.
for the most part, it was like they were the Ghost in
Yeah,
the
they're
Shell.
part of the they're
They
part
were
of
they were the secret
the
police,
government. Yeah.
and they were usually fighting corporations or other. Sometimes they were fighting people who went off
Mhm.
as lone wolf crazy villains
Yeah.
who could be described as cyberpunk because they did crazy shit.
Okay, so here's my question: is it not cyberpunk, or is Ghost in the Shell the Japanese version based on their aesthetics and their idea of culture and their history, their idea of cyberpunk, right? Because cyberpunk, as we said, it grew up in well, I guess it comes from punk, which grew up in Europe, and cyberpunk comes from the main authors are, I believe, American, right? Um, so it came from, yeah. So um, is it just like when you translate those ideas, it gets filtered through the Japanese frame of reference, and you end up with something like Ghost in the Shell? And
So
if that's
they're
not true, then what are the things that makes Ghost in the Shell
so maybe they're
significantly different than our Europe, not European, but our
so maybe
English point of view?
so maybe our version of rebellionism has more like individual punk doing your own thing to it, whereas the sort of offshoots or the people who aren't the secret police that they're going up against are often more like mafia organizations and like the underworld who are trying to take over aspects of the government. So it's
In
they're more against
in
organized crime.
Okay. Yeah, I do wonder though if that's just like a. So you're right that there are like strong corporations, and if you look in Japan, they have a history of having large corporations that control large swaths of the economy. But I wonder if their softness of like their ideas come from the fact that um, Japan as a whole doesn't have as negative a view of their large corporations,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, there's more of a idea that a large corporation can work responsibly, Whereas there is like the punk aesthetic comes from the idea, grows out of, punk. So the cyberpunk aesthetic grows out of the punk aesthetic where corporations and governments cannot be trusted with their power. They will inevitably abuse it and use it to control the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't demonize the backdrop of the corporations like controlling everything in Ghost in the Shell was like sort of downplayed. It's just
it's almost like there's individuals bad actors, but there's nothing wrong with the, what do you call it, the system, right? The system is not necessarily the problem, it is the actors in the system.
Yes, it's the ways of it getting co-opted either by like individuals who want to take control over it or by criminal organizations who are trying to work through it. So
right, okay, so that is so I guess the big thing is, though, even though the visually it's a lot closer, right? The Japanese kind of anime cyberpunk-esque or post-humanism is very close to the cyberpunk, which is, I guess, what you call the flag bearer of English-speaking post-humanism. The themes are very different.
Yeah, you still see people in that.
I guess the themes are not very different, but they're fundamentally different in their views of corporations and their roles in the world.
Yeah, on the surface level, you still get some of the same elements of people doing weird things with technology, like some person just becoming a walking box. You're like, oh, I've been talking to this person for a while, and they show up and meet him. It's like, oh, this guy's now a brain in a box. Okay, it's just so on the surface, yeah, it can often Ghost in the Shell and the Japanese version of the sort of future with a bit of dystopian element to it may come off differently than like the European thought of it. But just because it's the future, there's certain ways when people like do weird one-off things with technology, it sort of all feels kind of cyberpunk.
Yeah. People turning into furries.
I'm trying to think if there's furries in
I just had to throw that in there.
I think the Japanese might not like hairy things as much as the West. The West might be more okay with hairy wolf people.
Are furries more popular in Western culture?
I don't want to think about furries right now. We're talking about cyber. We can leave furries alone.
I always like bringing it up because you're like, all right. Only because your reaction to that topic. Okay, so what we're saying is, how come in skirmish games there is not enough cyberpunk? And if there is, okay, now I've got to look up that actual game that came out that was like distinctly cyberpunk. Miniature games.
Yeah, I think I've looked up a bunch, but they were all the major sci-fi ones are not.
Yes. I think the most popular general one where you could have miniature gaming aspects is Shadowrun. Like it is it's a role-playing game, but there's a lot of overlap, right? And I do feel like that is
so with Infinity, I guess you could say that like the armies in Infinity actually more represent the corporate elements of the world you'd expect in the future.
Yeah, but it's not even corporates, right? Because they still have nation states, right? It's actually nation state armies, well, which is why it doesn't really feel.
Well, they say if you get into more of the mercenary stuff, which they talk about how a lot of the conflicts actually more occur like not between the nations themselves, but between the hired actors that are mercenary companies.
But they're not using, like in the fluff, when you play the RPG, right? You're supposed to be playing a UN character. But maybe this is why the aesthetic of I'm just thinking like maybe this is the aesthetic of Infinity is not cyberpunk, because Infinity setting came from an RPG, and the RPG, I believe everyone played characters part of the Super UN, which is the UN with a standing army, which is basically the world government. So the aesthetics of the people who were playing in Infinity was the idea that having a world government with like world government, like world police, is a good thing, right? So if you were to ask, the idea of like that idea is almost antithetical to the cyberpunk themes.
Yeah, I think I've read more of the fluff based around like the mercenary actors in the world. So
Mm-hmm.
bought some of the source books from the.
So yeah, so the mercenary actors are definitely there as a force, but the ones people generally play are the government actors, which changes it a lot, right? It's not like you have 5 different mercenary companies that you're supposed to be playing. It's like eight different nations, and you play an army from that nation,
Yeah,
right?
and often in the fluff they talk about how they're fighting the alien outside nations.
Yep. So to me, like, while they could have leaned into the mercenary stuff and made it more cyberpunk, they did not, right? But the game that I was talking about is Reality's Edge.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of it, but
Yeah, it's by the same guy that I think did the post-apocalyptic game.
Fallout? No.
No, his name is Joseph McGuire.
Where are we?
The other game is more. This is not a test.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff with hacking and things like that in that game. Do you feel like hacking is important for cyberpunk to work as an aesthetic? I know that we mentioned basically the idea of having 2 covert ops teams, or at least 1 covert ops team doing something. It could be technically asymmetric, where you're trying to assault I don't know, like a corporate tower. Would be cool. Do you feel like if you did not have the hacking, though, would it be cyberpunk?
I think there has to be people like with the technology built into them that has some sort of like limited resource to it. Just so it's like almost a magical element, but it can be built into them. Like they have implants that maybe use up power and stuff like that. But it doesn't have to
I actually think there has to be hacking.
There has to be some sort of network that you're interacting with.
There has to be some sort of network that, like, which I guess maybe that plays out in my conception of what is cyberpunk. I think there has to be punks, right? At least if it's 2 corporations fighting each other, it's not cyberpunk. But if punks are a major part of your world, and then you still need the corporations, right? You need both corporations, and you need some sort of conflict between corporations and punks, whether or not it always has to happen. Let's say you have 5 different factions or 10 different factions, but there has to be punks. They have to be a major aesthetic, and there has to be, the mercenaries, that kind of idea of people fighting under the corporate heel, and then also having some sort of corporations at least influence, whether it's the actual soldiers on the ground, right? Because, the idea of cyberpunk can be the corporations hire these secret teams to go and fight for them, right? And do their espionage. I think that is important. So that falls directly, like, perfectly into skirmish games. But I think the hacking, I think the post-humanism, I think that's what you're mentioning, right? It needs to be there. Otherwise, it can literally, there's no cyber part, right? The cyber part has to be there, but I think the hacking has to be there as well.
Yeah, you don't necessarily.
It's such a strong theme.
It doesn't have to be hacking as a weapon necessarily, but it has to be like some sort of resource, possibly, that you're working.
Yeah, I would say, like, if you have a Infinity-esque kind of game where it's covert action teams fighting each other over whatever objective. If you were to add in hacking, not necessarily as people on the ground there, but hacking of some sort, like you said,
it could even be more like you as the commander are controlling.
Are the hacker or whatever that is, or at least you have a hacker with you, and then you command the hacker is offsite, and you have your team, who is actually the people on the table, right? They are basically they're hooked in with the hackers, and they have an ability to allow the hackers to project through them.
Yeah, either they're trying to hook into things on the table, or they're trying to like get other people, like other robots, off the table that have hacking controls, or take them over, or things like that.
So the problem, I feel like I think that's great, and I think that almost makes more sense in terms of how hacking works in the media of Cyberpunk. But the problem I have with that in terms of miniature games is, how do you then take a character like a model that looks so fucking cool as a hacker and put it on the table? Because you know that's what miniature gamers want. They're like, oh, I painted this cool hacker with his cyber rig and stuff like that. But if they're always off the table, why did I paint this miniature?
Well, maybe they're the ones that, like, if you're actually trying to hack into something on the table, they have to. They're the ones you need to use to perform the action, or so they let you project your power better because they've got the tech on them.
So the hackers on the table, basically for specific missions, you're like, oh, I have to take my hacker along because he has to be on the table. But he literally has no guns.
You're the nerdy hacker. You're too feeble to run across the board. You've just got to like call him on the phone.
No, I think it's cooler if you literally, like, for certain missions, like, so everyone has hacking, right? You put in a hacker in your team, right? You always need to have a hacker because, of course, Cyberpunk, right? But for certain missions, you have to bring your hacker onto the table, and it becomes like an HVT, like a high value target that literally sucks at fighting. Like, literally any other guy, like, they don't even have to roll dice when they fight. Literally, if an enemy reaches hand to hand with your hacker, he just loses. Right? He just like loses that fight, but he is needed on whatever missions to get to the terminal to control it.
Yeah, it's kind of like War Machine, where you've got your warcaster, but in this case, he's actually like the worst fighter on the table.
That's exactly. He's terrible at fighting. He's just like, okay, you need this guy
and stuff like that. But it's like, oh no, don't make your nerd fight.
I would say like only for certain missions. I think that would be really cool if like you can just use his normal abilities offsite for normal missions, but like certain missions where you're like, okay, you need to take your HVT. He can't die. Like if he dies, you lose the game, right? Like he said, right? But like he literally has to get to the terminal to succeed that mission. Yeah. That would be great. Then you only ever have like one or two hackers.
I would totally dig that just because of how much media and stuff there is out there with all that. But
anyway. Your HVTs are always hackers? Yeah, that'd be great. Man, now I want to play this
Cyberpunk game.
Non-existent Cyberpunk game. You should send a message to Infinity. Could you create like a version of? Oh, I guess they couldn't really do it, but yeah.
You make an expansion for the RPG or whatever. Anyhow, so we've gone on for a while of that. Should we move over? You still
Here's
want to
the thing. We've gone so long. I think there's so much to talk. I think we got to make this a two-parter.
You think we can do a whole Grimdark? Wow.
Oh, definitely. Grimdark is even more with miniatures.
I have more on this piece of. Okay, it's not a full piece of paper. It's just a sticky note. But there's more on the sticky note about the Grimdark than there is about the Cyberpunk.
Okay, so do we want to? So we've talked about Cyberpunk, what it is, the themes, the history.
What would
make a great game? Do you have anything we want to say about Cyberpunk before we wrap this part of the episode and up?
I think it's hard to paint Cyberpunk just because we're talking about miniatures.
Okay, yeah. Let's go with the aesthetics. I know I spent so much time bashing aesthetics and saying that's not Cyberpunk. You need the themes. But let's talk about the aesthetics.
So obviously it has like the 80s, like if you think the 80s synthwave sort of like imagery, which people might not totally think about, but there's a lot of like dark purple, dark blue to it with a lot of like glowing sunset colors. So if you think of your glowing yellow, your oranges, your glowing pinks.
Yeah, it has a very 80s aesthetic.
And it's mostly, it's kind of almost like a film noir thing, but not quite. Because it's got like the dark backdrop, because those colors only look right at night.
Yeah. And now that you mention it, when was film noir popular? The 50s? Was it the 50s and 60s, or
Yeah,
was it earlier than that? It was earlier than that, right?
it was around then, but maybe earlier. But
Because the
because
80s is now 40 years ago. Maybe not 40 years ago. Ended 30 years ago, right? So that
because
entire aesthetic to people growing up now is alien, right?
which
Because to
aspect?
them, it's just
Noir?
history. No, so the 80s, the 80s aesthetic, neon, bright colors, this thing. Like we have bright colors and screens, like we mentioned,
Hmm.
but we don't have the 80s aesthetic idea of like representation of those things, right? Because now we have full color, we can show everything. We don't think about neon as something to use to be bright, whereas in
No,
the 80s
because
the
what they
only
had,
colors you could make that's so bright is neon, right?
yeah,
It
no,
had to be neon.
they had tube lights to work with, whereas now you go to like a sports stadium, and there aren't just like a couple of like light bulbs that light up. You've now just got LCD screens that just ring the whole arena,
Mm-hmm.
and there's multiple layers of these rings and
with
screens
yeah with
everywhere.
any color that you want. In
Mhm.
terms of glowing, it can shine with the light of the sun. It lights up the entire place. It doesn't have to, like, you don't need neon to, like, neon colors to make them actually be seen.
No, and the thing about neon colors is they don't really work unless you've got darkness around. Like if you think of the sports stadium, that's like
Uh-huh.
pretty well lit because they're trying to play sports in it, and then you put neon lights there, you won't really notice. They don't. The contrast isn't there, so they don't work. You need like this backdrop of like night.
Mm-hmm.
Which when you think about punk, you're like, yeah, okay, they're not just walking around during the day with all the normal people. The punks come out at night, and so the
Yeah, I
whole
think that's like almost, what is that tied to? Is it the tied to the music scene?
yeah music. You think of all the music when
It
music.
probably is tied. The fact that it's like nighttime thing,
Mhm.
it tied to the music scene. The fact that people don't go in the day to listen to music
No, you
because
think
they
of
have to work.
you think of underground music acts like if they started at 11 o'clock for an underground music act, that's early.
Yes,
Mhm.
everyone's got to get off their late night shift before they can come.
Yes, because the punks are working. Maybe not.
Everyone has to work.
Yeah,
So
by
like
night.
you got to afford all of those spikes on your thing. You got to do something. You probably just hate your job. The important part of it is not that you don't have a job, it's that you hate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Unless I guess you're the actual musician.
Yes. But just
Okay, so the neon colors is a thing, and it's literally a retro cool thing from the fact that Cyberpunk grew up in a time where that was just the aesthetic. And when we think, because of that, it has taken on this neon uh, aesthetic of the future.
yeah.
Whereas if you look at Ghost in the Shell, it was created in the 90s and stuff where technology was advanced enough that you didn't need neon colors. So the idea is that they would just be like TV screens like now, right? It's modern enough that the technology,
Uh-huh.
it's closer to the actual technologies that we have now. Whereas the neon was really just extrapolating the aesthetic or the use of color at the time. That was basically just technology limited.
Yeah, and I think I've watched some gameplay of Cyberpunk 2077. So
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of different areas to the game, and some of it's during the day, some of it's at night. But they
Mm-hmm.
embrace sort of the futuristic aesthetic and the neon cyberpunk looking aesthetic in the game, where some
Mm-hmm.
districts you'll be there at night when it's raining and you've got like the glowing signs on the buildings you're going into in like
Mm-hmm.
shadowy places. But then during the day, there's just people dressed in like futuristic clothing and they have sort of implants, but it's all
Mm-hmm.
more subtle. But the clothing
Mm.
is much less conformist too for the sort of people who are the characters who are being more punkish.
Mm. So and the people who are dressed more well kind of gives it accentuates the uniqueness of the characters, right? Because like we said, the aesthetics of cyberpunk is you have that layer of normalcy of society that is working, but then you have this giant seedy underbelly, like how the actual, what do you call it, how the pie is made. What do they call it? Is it how the whatever is made? how the sausage is made, right? This entire seedy underbelly of how the sausage is made, which is the punk idea, right? Where you have which is where you have these corporations who are doing seedy shit, right? They have espionage, they kind of do all of this terrible stuff, right? And then you have the people at the bottom who just like work and toil to help, it's a very anti-capitalist message.
But just bring it back to like the potential for painting things like that. That it's sort of tough to paint that aesthetic and make it
the uniqueness and the neonness, except for the retro coolness of it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try and paint it with the whole neon look. I think it basically, you may just have to make it look like the armies at night for it to work. So you may have to just base your stuff really darkly to make the glowing aspect of the guys.
Yeah, I think so. I think it really is. The cyberpunk look has to be neon. It is literally an 80s retro look. Kind of like if you go further beyond, like past that, you get the turn of the century space look, which has kind of come back in a lot of, not a lot, but in some sort of media where it's like, what did people think of the science fiction future when the only thing was the Saturn V rocket? Like the only rocket that people thought of that could go into space was the Russian one, right? And then there's that aesthetic with fish bowls and shit like that, right? That it is very rooted, that kind of aesthetic is rooted in its time, right? And the people's ideas. I think cyberpunk has now, in some ways, in terms of the aesthetic, has been locked into the age that it was born in, even though technologically speaking, it doesn't make sense for modern technology.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that works with cyberpunk is that it was so, although if you read the books now, they're a little, there's some stuff doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's so prescient, right? Some things were done so well that they're obviously, the idea of them coming to fruition in the future makes sense. Like hacking, right? Mind hacking, right? That's heavy AIs, like body modification with, like, I don't know, your nails flip up and then you have daggers for nails, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because people are totally willing to wear smart watches right now that monitor their biometrics.
Yeah, so, and there's people that were trying to do cybernetic augmentation, right? Even though you can't really do it yet. They're like, I want to put in whatever kind of whatever monitor inside my body so that I am now a Cyberman.
Yeah, and there's people who are willing to wear the earpieces all the time, so they don't even have to touch their technology. They're like, no, I can just voice control this and walk around using the technology.
I, at home, almost always wear these headphones so I can listen to whatever streamed through my phone. If you think about like the interface, the only difference is that it doesn't pierce my skin. But these are literally on my ears almost all the time.
Yeah, and if you could make them less intrusive by implanting them, you'd be like, yeah, go for it.
If there weren't any bad side effects, sure. Not really, but like I could see people doing it. Would I do it? Would you get cybernetic implants?
No, I'm pretty much a Luddite.
Really? I seem to remember someone having like surgery, although I guess that was medically.
That was necessary.
Okay, fair enough. So you would not be one of the technologically advanced people in a cyberpunk world.
No, I'm trying to stick towards going towards.
Not even claws?
Not guns that pop out of your arm? No.
Okay, how about super fast jumping or super strong jumping?
That becomes more tempting, actually. That's fun.
Yeah, reinforced legs that can jump. That'd be cool. Okay.
Like if I had my hips turned bad, I'd be like, yeah, give me the cybernetic hips.
I'm gonna have to get a hip replacement anyways. Might as well have the cybernetic one. Okay, so then in a cyberpunk future, let's say there's a cyberpunk game, or we just end up in that dystopian future because we live a long time. where would you want to be if you could have a choice? Which side would you be on?
So we're now differentiating between like the Star Trek and the Cyberpunk universe.
Yeah, so no, I'm saying like in the Cyberpunk universe, um, which side do you think you would be on? Where
Oh,
would you be?
I'd be on the corporates. There's no question.
Okay.
Or
You'd be on the
no,
corporate side.
actually, maybe not. The corporates embrace it. I might just be on the people. Like you think of Ghost in the Shell, there was that one last inspector who refused to connect himself to the network for the longest time in standalone
So
complex. And then
you would be
eventually,
the Luddite. You would literally be you would be a cyberpunk guy. You would be the guy that's off grid. Everyone else has their implants, and you're like, I don't need an implant. Fuck that. And they would hire you to like do jobs where you have to be off the grid.
where they can't detect you because you don't
Yeah.
have the eye implants and everything else.
Unfortunately, because you don't have any implants, you are also basically incompetent relative to everyone else because you don't have your super jumpy legs or your like gun arms and shit.
Mm-hmm.
Get that gun arm, man, and laser eye too.
That guy in Ghost in the Shell got the shit kicked out of him all the time.
Until he finally like, fine, I'm gonna get my cybernetic arm or something, or his arm
So,
gets ripped off or something. He has to replace it.
I think that was like spine broken or something.
Oh, then he has to do it after his spine gets broken. He's like,
Something like that.
fine, I'll do it. Now I have an amazing cybernetic body. I'm awesome.
No, he just went to
It's still sucky. He got his spine broken. It's not this is gonna be amazing. Okay, all right. So that's if you were there. What happens if you had to build an army for a miniatures game? Our theoretical cyberpunk game.
Oh,
What would your army be?
I'll go for the punks entirely, just because I have so many armies. Like Infinity certainly satisfied the futuristic army urge. I would just go down the punk road.
I think I would do the corporations, honestly. Even though like politically and whatever and like if I were to do it, I would almost certainly be on the punk side. Like if I was living in the world, it's kind of the idea of owning the army that's the bad guy seems fun to me. Like my army is all of the people that I don't know, don't like in real life.
Well, maybe I view the punks as the bad guys.
Fair enough. All right. So we've gone through a lot of stuff about cyberpunk, and we've gone through enough that we don't have time for the grimdark. So we're gonna split this into a two-parter. We'll go into grimdark the next time and what the difference is between cyberpunk and grimdark in terms of miniature gaming and maybe just in general. But if you have any ideas about cyberpunk, you want to talk to us about your favorite kind of game. If you know a game that is really good cyberpunk, if you've played that game we mentioned, which I haven't actually played. What was the game I mentioned again?
Is it Shadowrun? No.
No. The tabletop one. Oh my god, I'm terrible at this.
I thought it was Shadow something, but anyhow. Or was that the RPG?
Well, that's the RPG.
Okay.
Anyways, if you have any kind of Reality's Edge, that was the name. So if you played Reality's Edge, or you have any other cyberpunk games that you think are awesome that we could play with that are similar to the ideas we mentioned, or just games that you really, really enjoy, give us a shout. Tell us what it is.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
All right. This has been Alan.
Yeah, it's been Brandon.
Oh, I forgot. If you want to contact us, to be able to do that, email us at contact at diceovereverything.com or find us on Facebook at Dice Over Everything Group.
Yep, Dice Over Everything Group, just because we talked over each other.
Yep. All right. Now, that's it.
It is.
Bye.